Hi everyone, Miss Beth here from Vandegrift Library again. Talk about the online services so that you can find information that'll help you with your genealogy research. I'm sure you've all seen the commercials for Ancestry.com. That's probably the one that does the most advertising in print and on television. There's also FamilySearch.org, Genia Bank, Family Heritage, Find a Grave, Billion Graves, Fold3, newspapers.com, and we'll talk about all of those plus a few other things that you can find help with online with your search, and also different resources, and many of them also will host your family tree information as well if you don't care to buy a separate family tree program in order to do that. So all of these different places we'll also have a list of resources for you. All of these different websites offer a little bit different. Everybody offers a little bit different things. Some are specific. Fold3 is a military website. Their sole focus is military records. Like, you can't go there probably and find census records or things like that. They're going to have military discharges, rosters, widow pension applications, that sort of thing from Civil War through World War II. That's what's online right now. It does go a little bit later with the rosters, but the pensions and etc. is the older wars. Newspapers.com is just what its name says. It's newspapers online. They've all been microfilmed. You can either you can copy the whole page of the newspaper. You can make a clipping, which is you just take out the one article that you need, the obituary or the article that mentions your ancestor, and then you can save it onto your computer, or you can save it, if you have Ancestry, you can save it into Ancestry. Ancestry actually offers a package that includes newspapers.com, the basic subscription, and Fold3, so that you could have one subscription and get all three of those. I think it actually works out a little bit less costly that way, but most of the websites that are online that'll help you research your history they'll let you have so much free, and then you have to pay for the next level or the next levels. So I know Ancestry's like that. I believe a lot of the other ones are too. The one exception to that rule is FamilySearch.org, which is actually run by the Church of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. And they have a huge, huge database of all kinds of sources that they offer for free on the FamilySearch.org. Sometimes they're records you could find on Ancestry. A lot of times they're not. They also have, for items that are not online yet, you can order from the main office. This is all online, naturally, how to do it. You can order from the main office how to microfilm of those records, have it sent to your local LDS Family Center, and you can go there and look at the film. I believe there is a charge for the copies, but other than that, there isn't. So there is one free big service, so to speak, that you can work with. I personally work with FamilySearch.org, and I also work with Ancestry.com. And I have a full subscription, so I also have newspapers.com and Fold3. So what can you find on Ancestry? Well, you can find pretty much anything. Since I have a full worldwide subscription, I have access to records from Europe and South America. They're just starting now to get more records in from the eastern provinces, like China, Japan, some of the formerly communist countries. Records are starting to become available. So that's available to me through Ancestry.com. And that includes church records, marriages, baptisms, births, deaths, civil records for marriages and things like that, birth registrations from different countries, census from some countries. I know the census is from Scotland, Ireland, and some English census are available on Ancestry.com. I actually found my personal birth certificate on Ancestry.com. And that was a little bit of a surprise, but it was really cool at the same time. Like I said, census records are a big thing that are available on Ancestry. So they have all the census records that have currently been released are on Ancestry, with the exception of 1890, because most of it was destroyed in a fire at the place where they stored them. There are some reconstructive censuses and some other alternative methods to gathering information from the 1890 census, like that same kind of information, but not the actual federal census, as it was almost completely destroyed. What else do they have? Well, they have tax lists from back in the 1700s, where it would say, you know, that so-and-so, John Smith, was taxed, and he had a horse, 2 cows, and a goat, and a house. And you can find out a lot about your ancestors from further back in history by looking into these tax lists. And also, some of the Pennsylvania archives are online there. They have various records of early Pennsylvania, assuming your people are from Pennsylvania, but also from other places around the world. So if your family was one that early on moved west or settled in, you know, like the far west, like out on the west coast, Washington, California, Oregon, maybe they went with the 49ers with the gold rush, but originally they came from this area. Ancestry is going to be a gold mine for you, literally, because if before the advent of Ancestry and these other online services, there was really no way to get a census from a place you didn't live. You could find them at a local repository, like, say, the Western Pennsylvania Genealogical Society would have it on microfilm. But as far as, say, you needed it, your ancestor was born here, but they moved to Wisconsin or Washington State, you were completely out of luck unless you knew someone who lived there could look it up for you, or you would write to the library, and maybe they would have it and maybe they wouldn't. This way you have the entire federal census for the entire United States at your fingertips. And it is so helpful because you can, like I said, track ancestors, where they moved, if they moved several times, where they ended up, where their family stayed when, you know, the older ones passed on. Did the family stay there? Did they move somewhere else? So it's really a blessing to have them available. They also have you see it all the time on TV, the little shaky leaf hints, which are a good thing and a bad thing. They're a good thing if you go and look at them with a grain of salt, because yes, they're a hint for someone who has the same name or a very similar name to your ancestor. But you'd be surprised how many people there are in the United States with the exact same name as your ancestor. Even though you think it's an unusual name, there's probably at least one other person that has it. So you'll find you need to research, look into the hints and make sure they're actually for your ancestor. Are they the right time frame? Are they the right area? Because you'll see if people don't pay attention, then you get these like a life story for a person. It'll say that they were born in Armstrong County and they lived in Armstrong County in the 1800, 1890, 1810, 20, 30, 40 census. And in 1850, all of a sudden, they're like in Kansas. And then they come back to Armstrong County for 1860, 70, 80. Without some other kind of proof, I would not assume my ancestor went to Kansas for 10 years, because more than likely they stayed in Armstrong County. If they were born here and died here, yeah, they could have gone someplace else, but I would look into that very clearly. And most likely there would be a story in the family somehow of, oh yeah, Uncle Jim, he went off to Kansas and lived there for 5 years. He worked on a big farm out there, and then he saved all his money and came back, and he and Aunt Gladys got married. You know, that kind of a story. But otherwise, don't assume because it has the same name as your ancestor, it is your ancestor, because it could very well be someone else's ancestor. Through Ancestry, you can also access the newspapers.com, which is very helpful because it'll allow you to get actual obituaries for people that have passed away. They don't have all the newspapers in the United States. That would be really hard. But they have a lot of the ones from bigger towns. Now, they do have The subscription that you get with Ancestry only includes their basic service. So if you want the big papers, like the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and the Pittsburgh Press and the Post-Gazette, there's an additional fee you would still have to pay to get those papers. But you can get the Katanning papers back into the 1800s and the Indiana papers. But I do not believe they have the Valley News Dispatch yet. Of course, like any of these resource gathering services, it's an ongoing project, so they're always getting more and more information in. Birth certificates, when they first started printing birth certificates and death certificates, previously you had to send to the state to receive those, and it could take weeks or months to get one back if they had one. Now, Pennsylvania's death certificates are online, and their birth certificates are coming online as the 70 years Privacy Act. So up until, somebody has died, say, up until 67, I believe, is you can have a death certificate. And the Pennsylvania started keeping birth certificates and death certificates in 1906. So you can get birth certificates also. The death certificates come in very handy because just because you always thought that great-grandpa's mother was Sheila Shannon, it turns out his real mother was Esther Thompson, and she died right after she had him. So he was the only child who was not by Miss Shannon. That happened to me, my second great-grandfather. We always thought his mother was a Shannon, but no, she was a Thompson. And so that was completely, I had a whole line back to the 1500s on that, and it was like, nope, sorry, none of that's good. So have to start all over on that Thompson line and see where they came from, who the parents are. That's like a whole nother line of research, which is why this hobby never gets old, because every time you think you have it, okay, I'm caught up and I have this where I want it, you find out something new. And birth certificates are good if people had always went by one name, but you find out it's not their real name, that they were named something else at their birth. I always include that. And that way you can track them despite which name they had. Sorry about that. Fold 3, also available through Ancestry.com, is, like I said previously, full of military records. You can find, track your ancestor through the Civil War for where they were at whenever the muster rolls were read, and it tells you where they were at and if that person was present. If they were wounded, it normally tells you if they were in the hospital, or it'll tell you if they were AWOL. You can also see if the person was killed, or even if they survived. When they do the widow's pension applications, you can see the widow's maiden name sometimes. You can see if there was any minor children at the time the veteran passed away. So there's a lot of records like that are useful. There's actually the draft cards for World War I and World War II are available, and you can those will have on the date of birth, the place of birth. A lot of times the back of the card will have the person's height, their weight, eye color, hair color, interesting little facts to help flesh out the ancestor. And they also usually have a person to contact in case of emergency. And if the person's married, 9 times out of 10, it's the wife. But sometimes if they're not, it could be one of their parents or their sister, or you could find some other relatives that way, as well as the fact that the person, say it's John Smith's draft card, he's giving the draft person the information himself directly. So those are pretty accurate as far as dates of birth and places of birth go, because they were given at that time frame, like in 1918 or 1945 or 1942, by the person the information is about. So you assume you know your own information pretty well. So that makes them very valuable. On FamilySearch.org, they have a lot of marriage records that aren't available anywhere else. They also have family trees you can look at that are, as does Ancestry, that are provided by people who use the site. Anybody that uses the site can put a family tree on there. My only caveat with that would be other people who come along and are also connected to your family that you may or may not know can also make additions and corrections to your tree, or it was that way last time I checked. And if you're okay with that, that's fine. But if you're not, that's something you want to think about before you put a tree there. But they do have a lot of information and a lot of family trees on that site. And you can search by date. You can search by event, like if you want to know about a marriage or if you want to know about a death, you want to know about a baptism. You can, and it'll bring up, they have census records as well. So if you put in just your ancestor's name and their date range from when they were born to when they were died, it'll bring up any record that mentions them, whether it's their marriage record, a child's marriage record, any kind of a census record. Both Family Search and Ancestry have city directories, so it'll bring up phone books they were in. Ancestry now is also using yearbooks. It'll bring up yearbook pictures and like clubs that the people belong to. So using the two in combination, you can cover a whole lot of ground and have access to a whole lot of records, and all at your fingertips. But be forewarned, you can also end up staying up half the night doing research on some line of your family that you just kind of go down a rabbit hole, and then you're trying to find out how is this person and which wife had which children, and they're not directly related to you, but it's still a really interesting story. Find a Grave and Billion Graves are both volunteer-run sites that record graves and cemeteries throughout the world. I work with Find a Grave, and so I have put cemeteries or parts of cemeteries onto Find a Grave. In addition to people that do that, they also have volunteer photographers. So say somebody here wanted a picture from St. Gertrude's Cemetery, they would, it comes up on your little page, that we need these pictures from St. Gertrude's. So you could go to St. Gertrude's, take a picture of that grave, and then you post it for the person who asked for it. So somebody who lives in, California could have a picture of their great-grandfather's grave here in Vandergrift without having to fly here and try to find it. And so it's like I said, all volunteer is a really great thing. And Billion Graves is set up the same way. And they record burials at sea. They record burials from different sources. Not only, some people are fortunate enough to be able to use a cemetery book, like the actual cemetery record, in order to enter the graves, but sometimes you have to go from obituaries, because it says in the obituary they were buried at this cemetery, and that might be the only record there is at the time, because either the records are lost or they're not available to the public. So I recommend doing that kind of work. FamilySearch.org also uses volunteer indexers for census records and tax lists and things like that. It's another thing where your knowledge of your area can come in very handy. Some other sites use people not from the area. So like if I was going to sign up, or I do volunteer for Family Search as well. I sign up usually for Pennsylvania records, and if I can get them, Western Pennsylvania records. I think if you've lived someplace a while, you have a better concept of like the naming patterns and the names even. Like if I'm doing something in the Alakiski area or the Kiski Valley, I know a lot of the names from this area, so I'm not going to misinterpret to something completely different just because of my knowledge of the people who live here, and since I study the history of the area, that have lived here for a long time, so I kind of know what I'm looking for. So unless it's really badly mangled, a lot of times somebody who is from the area can actually figure out a name rather than having someone who has no idea what the name might be, and you come up with something that has several question marks or asterisks in it because they're unable to figure out what it is. I think genealogy is kind of, in my opinion, a karma-driven kind of research. If you are helpful to other people, it'll come back to you. If you have books, old county history books or maybe a family Bible or something like that. If you can share things like that onto these pages, that's very helpful for other people, some of whom you may not even know, but nevertheless, it's, you know, what goes around comes around. If you help them at some point when you need help, you may stumble upon an entry in a book that you would have never thought to look in, and there's your ancestor, and it goes back 3 generations from that. So those kind of things happen all the time when you're studying genealogy. Another thing we'll just kind of touch on, because it's a big deal now too. You always see ads for DNA. There's several DNA companies as well. There's Ancestry.com, obviously, and there's 23andMe and several others that also do DNA. It's not the same kind of DNA testing normally that you would see like on crime shows, but it could be used for that, because there have been cases recently where crimes were solved because the suspect DNA matched to somebody who was on one of these big databases like Ancestry or 23andMe, and they were able to track down who the person was based on their DNA match with like a second cousin or a third cousin. And so in my opinion, that's not a bad thing. DNA testing on most of these involves spitting into a tube or swabbing your cheek and sending it off to the different company, and they analyze it for you. Some of them will give you an ethnic background as well as match you with other people that have shared DNA with you. I am not very good with the DNA. It's kind of blows my mind. There's so much to it, but I have a cousin who's been doing it, and she's got it down pat. And so she's been finding a whole bunch of new cousins for us that are DNA matches to us, and it confirms a lot of the research that we have done. And in some cases, it brings up questions of like, well, how did this person, you know, get into our DNA pool when we don't know anything about this branch of this family, which that'll happen. It's kind of like when you're doing research and you're finding the skeletons. DNA turns up more skeletons than anything, and in that case, you can't really deny it because DNA doesn't lie. So some people are finding out good news, finding out that their research has been correct, that their what they always thought as far as their ethnic background was right, and that then there's people that are finding out that their father is not their father, and their whole family is not like they thought it was, and it can be very traumatic and for everybody, for the people who don't know that there's an extra child, and the people that are the extra child, and so there's good and bad in it, and I think people need to be aware of that. That's a possibility before they do DNA. And that's also been a lot of people have been reunited who were adopted out, and then the family always wanted to know what happened to them. And this, you know, there's happy endings and there's not so happy endings. So it's just something to be aware of. But all in all, I think genealogy is a very fun. It can be time consuming. It's kind of gets to you. You know, you get the bug, and then you can't really shake it. Even though there's been times I couldn't work on it as much as I wanted to, it's always there in the back of your head. And somebody will say, oh, well, what about so-and-so? And so then you go back and look in your records, and you're able to help them, you know, figure out what's going on in their branch of the family. So I highly recommend everybody at least look into at the beginning of it, maybe back to your third or fourth great-grandparents, give you kind of an idea where you came from, what your family was like when you came here, if your family is Native American, if you were always here. There's just so many fascinating possibilities and so many different things to find out, and it can help you with your health, with your health history, if there's a history of genetic disease in your family. And like I said, it's got its good and it's got its bad, but when it all comes down to it, family's family, and nothing can change that. So I hope you all have enjoyed this little series, and I've enjoyed presenting it to you. And thank you very much, and goodbye.